forgotten witches of southern Ohio never disappeared. They just stopped telling outsiders what they were doing. Fog has been rising from these hollows since before anyone thought to write any of it down. Carved marks on barnwood, specific plants beside a farmhouse door, whispered words over a sick child at midnight. These were not superstitions left behind by frightened people who didn't know any better. This was a coherent, living system of knowledge, and the hills of southern Ohio protected it from outsiders for over 2 centuries. What does a tradition look like when it deliberately refuses to be seen? It doesn't vanish. It hides inside the ordinary, inside a garden row, a knotted cord, a remedy handed from a grandmother's cracked hands to a granddaughter's steady ones. The women who held this knowledge weren't performing anything for anyone. They were working, quietly, practically, with the same seriousness you'd bring to any skill that kept people alive. And to understand how that system took root in these hills, you have to go back to the people who carried it here in the first place. The people who first settled these Ohio hills didn't arrive empty-handed. They carried their fears and their remedies with them. Scots-Irish families pushed through the Cumberland Gap with hex signs stitched into their quilts and whispered cures for fever on their lips. German settlers followed, bringing powwow traditions so old that nobody alive could name their origin. These weren't fringe beliefs held by the desperate or the strange. They were the operating system of daily survival in a world without doctors or pharmacies. When the forests closed in around those first homesteads, isolation didn't weaken the old ways. It preserved them, sealed them like fruit in a jar against the outside world. Neighbors passed remedies across fence lines. Mothers pressed knowledge into daughters the way you press seeds into soil. The hills of southern Ohio became a vault, and the women who lived there became its keepers. What happened next, though, is the part that surprises people, because these imported traditions didn't simply survive the crossing. They changed. Every woman who kept a garden at the edge of the tree line was keeping something more than food. The plants she chose, and where she placed them, were a map of everything she knew about protection and healing. Mullein grew tall near the fence line, its thick leaves pressed into poultices for chest sickness, and its dried stalks burned to clear a room of something unseen. Yarrow clustered close to the door, because yarrow stopped bleeding fast, and in a hollow far from any doctor, fast was the only speed that mattered. Black cohosh pushed up from the shadowed edge where the garden met the woods, used for pain that women carried quietly and rarely named aloud. Pennyroyal crept low along the border, a plant whose uses were understood by every woman who grew it and almost never spoken of to men. The garden wasn't organized the way you'd find in any almanac or catalog from town. It was organized by need, by memory, and by what one woman had pressed into another woman's hands and said, "Grow this, learn this, keep this close." The knowledge lived in the arrangement itself, passed forward not through writing but through the act of planting, and the question that followed every seedling into the ground was the same one the hills had always asked: who do you trust enough to teach? When a child burned with fever in the middle of the night, there was no waiting until morning. The woman who came carried no bag of instruments, no written prescription. She carried what she'd grown and what she'd been taught. She'd lay a warm cloth of yarrow and plantain across the child's blanket, letting the heat rise gently while she worked, still warm from the pot, still smelling of the creek bank where she'd gathered it. Then she'd lean close, and she'd whisper. Not a prayer exactly, not a spell exactly, but something older than either word suggests. The words were specific, passed mouth to ear across generations, and you did not change them. Changing them meant they wouldn't hold. Her hands would move in a particular direction, always the same direction, drawing the sickness outward like pulling a splinter. Plant, word, and gesture weren't 3 separate things. They were one act, and the act only worked whole. What hung in that room wasn't superstition. It was the full weight of every woman who had done this before her. And the question that follows that woman home is simple. How did anyone come to trust her with something that precious? Every hollow had one, a woman the community had quietly decided to trust with the things doctors couldn't reach. She wasn't self-appointed, and she wasn't an outcast hiding at the edge of the settlement. She was named for it, the way a blacksmith is named for iron, because the community needed what she carried. People called her the Granny Woman, though she wasn't always old, and the title carried more weight than any certificate ever could. Neighbors brought her their laboring mothers, their fever-struck children, their grief that wouldn't lift after a hard winter. She knew which roots pulled infection from a wound and which words were spoken over the threshold to keep harm from crossing it. Her authority wasn't granted by a church or a courthouse. It lived in the results, passed mouth to ear across every kitchen table in the hollow. A girl who showed the right instincts might be quietly drawn into her orbit, watching, listening, absorbing what was never written anywhere. So how exactly did knowledge that precise survive without a single page to hold it? Nobody handed you a book when you were ready to learn. They handed you a bundle of dried yarrow and watched your hands. The knowledge lived in the body before it ever lived in the mind, passed through repetition until the motion itself became the memory. A woman might recite the same remedy verse every single morning for a decade before her daughter was trusted to say it alone. The words had to land in a particular order, with a particular breath, because the sequence was the protection. Changing even one phrase could turn a healing into something you didn't intend, and everyone in the hollow understood that. Writing it down wasn't laziness avoided, it was danger avoided, because paper could be found, read, and used against you by someone who hadn't earned the knowing. The tradition stayed alive precisely because it stayed invisible to anyone who hadn't been brought inside it. What you couldn't see, you couldn't take. So the question becomes, what happened to that careful invisibility when roads finally cut through the hills and strangers arrived with different ideas about what counted as knowledge? Those grooves cut into the barn beam weren't decoration, they were a lock, and someone believed the door to harm could be closed. Farmers across southern Ohio carved what scholars now call witch marks into door frames, lintels, and the hidden faces of beams where only the wood would ever see them. The most common shape was a daisy wheel, a 6-petaled flower drawn with a single compass stroke, its geometry meant to trap evil spirits inside the loop forever. Hex signs served a different purpose, each symbol a specific instruction, a ward against fire, or a blessing pressed into a particular season's harvest. The people carving these marks weren't performing superstition. They were practicing a precise and inherited technology of protection. A household without these marks was a household that hadn't bothered to lock its doors, and no sensible family left their doors unlocked. What's remarkable is how many of these marks still exist, hidden under paint or buried in collapsed timber, waiting. The hills kept the knowledge, and somewhere in those hills, someone still knows exactly what each line means. Somewhere in southern Ohio, an older woman is walking a garden she didn't plant, harvesting what her mother left her. She knows which leaf draws fever down and which root quiets a restless house, because someone told her, quietly, without ceremony. The tradition never announced itself as tradition. It just kept moving, hand to hand, season to season, through the women who stayed. Some of the old words have gone quiet, carried off with the people who held them, and that loss sits in the hills like a stone. But plant knowledge doesn't vanish cleanly. It hides in habit, in the way a woman reaches for yarrow before she reaches for anything else. You've probably passed a house with a carved mark above the door and never once wondered who put it there, or why. The fog still rises from the hollows every evening, the same as it always has, indifferent to whether anyone below still knows its name.